do on the basis of what authority? Because I told you.
Okay. He's talking about inductive preaching. He's talking about working toward a point. And I wanted to show this clip here because I think it's also the way that we need to approach the text. That instead of coming to the text and saying, this is what I want the text to tell me, we read the text and let the text tell us what it's saying. And then we can include that in the way that we preach too. People will learn how to study the Bible, how to draw things from the text by doing it that way. It's not the most natural way for most of us to try to construct a lesson, because that's not the way that we were taught how to do it. For me, it wasn't how I was taught how to do it. I was definitely taught a deductive way of both approaching the text and also preaching the text. But I guess one of the things I want to try to get us to do today in giving this time together is to think of some different ways of looking at it. And this is a different way. And I think that this way helps us to be better students. Over time, it's going to help our people to be better students. And so ultimately, we get into the text for the text to give us a message, and then we're going to take that message and we're going to put that message into a sermon, looking for the big idea that the text is trying to give us. Now let me just talk about a few other things about approaching the text itself. And I'll also talk in a minute about how to select a text. That approaching the text itself, the first point I want to mention is that prayer is crucial. We need to begin with prayer. We need to leave room for God to work and God's Spirit to work in our lives. And so we approach the text with a prayerful attitude. Psalm 119, verse 18. Open my eyes that I may see wondrous things from your law. But we begin there. I open my eyes. I want to see what you want to show me, God. And so we pray. We begin with a prayerful spirit. And this is something that we could spend a lot of time talking about because it is so important. In an introductory course like this, we just don't have time to talk about all these things in depth. But don't miss that. And we need to start with a prayerful attitude, asking God to really open up our eyes to the text. In Luke 5, verses 15 and 16, it says, But now even more the report about him went abroad, Jesus, and great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities. But he would withdraw to desolate places and pray. I mean, the audience was already there in front of him, but he removed himself from the audience to pray. This audience was following him, but he would remove himself to spend time with God. And that's where we got to begin. We got to get away from the audience, and we just got to spend time before God. Spend time in prayer. E.M. Bounds served as a chaplain in the Civil War, and then went on to preach at a number of different churches. But he woke up every morning, and from 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock, he prayed. That's how he spent his morning. 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock, he prayed. He wrote, The young preacher has been taught to lay all his strength on the form, taste, and beauty of his sermon as a mechanical and intellectual product. We have thereby cultivated a vicious taste among the people and raised the clamor for talent instead of grace, eloquence instead of piety, rhetoric instead of revelation, reputation and brilliancy instead of holiness. It needs to begin with just being quiet before the Lord, being silent before God, and asking Him to speak through His Word. The second thing in approaching the text is it's going to take time. So we begin with prayer, and then we have to set aside some time. And if you don't set aside the time's not going to come. The important things in life we make time for. And you're going to have to see that sermon preparation is an important part of your ministry. It's an important part of who you are as a preacher. And you're going to have to set aside some time that's going to be guarded time. This is time that's holy before the Lord. And you're going to guard this time to be able to get into the text. Someone asked me, how long does it take to prepare an expository sermon? Well, John Stott gives a rule of thumb here. I think it's a useful rule of thumb. He says, 1 hour of study for every 5 minutes of preaching. So that means that for many of us, if we follow that rule of thumb, we're going to be studying more or preaching less. But if you're going to keep up, if you're going to really follow that, then one of the others probably going to have to change. The thing is, though, in time, you learn how to do it, and it becomes a natural thing. For me, whenever I'm reading my Bible, it's just natural for me to dive into the text, try to draw the message from the text, and then I am working on, okay, well, how do I want to say this? What's the best way to say this? It becomes just a part of who you are. But at first, you might have to learn how to think about it, put some extra time into it up front. In the long run, that time that you put into it will pay off. Because in time, your messages will mature, you'll get better at it, you'll be more equipped to do it. This is a learned skill, and it's a skill that we can get better at in time. But we do have to put some guarded time into it. I like to start early in the week. I start on Monday, and I know what I'm going to be preaching about next Sunday. So I'll finish my sermon on Sunday, and then on Monday, I'll spend some hours on it. I'll spend 3 or 4 hours on Monday. I like to spend 3 or 4 hours on Tuesday. I like to put the heavy work into it at the beginning of the week. Why? Because the rest of the week, I can let it percolate. I can let it stew. I can get all the juices flowing. One of the things I love to do is I love to get up early in the morning and just work on my sermon, and then go out for a long run. Go out for a long bike ride. And when I'm doing it, I don't have anything in my ears. You know, sometimes I do that if I don't have something to think about. I listen to a lot of classes actually when I'm running. But after I work on a sermon or work on a class, I don't have anything in my ears, and I'm just listening to what I just did. And it's amazing some of the insight I get from the run, from just allowing it to stew, allowing it to percolate a little while. You know, they used to have these old coffee percolators. I think they still do. But my mom had one.
Women's got one.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, it just keeps coming up. And my mom had one that if she left it on, then if it started cooling down a little bit, then it would turn itself back on and start percolating again. And she and my grandma used to fight over the last cup of that coffee, because it had just percolated all day long. Back then, you know, you didn't have all these different types of coffee that we do today. They really wanted a darker coffee. And so to them, that was the best cup, was that last cup right there. And I think sometimes what we have to do is we have to allow the sermon to percolate. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this: if a sermon is prepared too soon, it perishes like manna in the wilderness. And so you got to put the time in, and you got to let it be there for a while. There's just no way to skip over this step. You know, it would be great, but if we're really going to preach this way, then it's going to take some time. Here's a great point that Haddon Robinson makes, and I really please listen to this, because I think this is crucial for us to. How are we going to find the time? How are we going to make the time? How are we going to take the time? And listen to what he has to say. On a cold, gloomy morning, a preacher worked on his sermon from breakfast until noon, with little to show for his labor. Impatiently, he laid down his pen and looked disconsolately out the window, feeling sorry for himself because his sermons came so slowly. Then there flashed into his mind an insight that had profound effect on his later ministry. Your fellow Christians, he thought, will spend far more time on this sermon than you will. They come from 100 homes. They travel hundreds of miles in the aggregate to be in the service. They will spend 300 hours participating in the service and listening to what you have to say. Don't complain about the hours you are spending in preparation and the agony you experience. The people deserve all you can give them. I think that's just a great point. When we realize, you know, okay, I'm spending 4 hours in my sermon right now, you realize that already the front row is doing that by listening to you. That's just the front row. You know, multiply all the other hours. Just them getting to church and getting back home from church. You know, we need to bring something to them every Sunday. And in order to do that, it's going to take some time on our part to do that. So that's the second point there is time. The third point, well, let me see if I can get back to this. Let me illustrate this by listening to what Walter Brueggemann has to say here. He's an Old Testament professor, wrote a number of books. One book that he wrote is called The Land. He also does some books on the introduction to the Old Testament. This is what he has to say on this.
Well, it's not for me to give advice, but I heard a rabbi say not long ago that Christian pastors have ruined the life of a rabbi, because a rabbi is a scholar and a preacher, but Christian pastors are social workers and therapists and budget managers, and now he said people in his synagogue expect him to do that. I would think that preachers, I think it's exceedingly difficult, but I think preachers have to decide what the main tasks are and practice enormous self-discipline about not being drawn away to do other things that do not properly belong to the ministry of word and sacrament. You can't do that completely, but I believe that many preachers finally get around to their sermon in their fatigue from everything else. And if imagination is the key to good preaching, you cannot be imaginative when you're exhausted. So I think it has to do with ordering one's priorities for the sake of one's best energy. And that, I think for many preachers, that means really deciding that this is the main task. And if you want the congregation to have missional energy and all of that, preaching is the pivot point for all of it. And if a pastor decides that, then the pastor is going to make more time for reading and study and prayer, which are the disciplines that cause the pastor to live to some extent in a different zone. And if we are to bring a word from elsewhere, then we have to live to some extent elsewhere. And I don't think that's very easy, given the huge demands and expectations on most pastors.
He talks about there the idea of not writing your sermon in your fatigue. And I know that's difficult to do. I know there have been many times where I've written the sermon in my fatigue, just tired out from life. And the last thing that I get around to is working on the sermon. And I think what we have to do is change our mindset. We have to make working on our lessons a priority. And also people around us are going to have to understand that this is something that we want this person to do. We want this person to have some time to study. And I suggest to wake up early and get at it. So really, studies have shown that the most productive time of the day is the early morning. It's when you're going to get your best work done. And there's a really fascinating and wonderful book out called Willpower. I highly recommend it if you like. It's beyond a self-help book. It's about self-control, but they do all these studies in it. It's really incredibly well done. But in the book, they talk about one of the things that wears people down so that they lose their willpower is there's only so many things that we can fight through during the day before we're just fatigued. Before we're just like, give up now, you know? And so the early morning, he points out, that's the best time to be productive. And a big part of preaching a good sermon, developing a good sermon, is just putting thought into it. So you have to be fresh to be able to do that. So for me personally, I like to wake up on Monday morning and just approach the text and start diving in. Prayer, reading the text over and over and over again, start breaking out some books, and as I'm doing it, thoughts are flowing, things are coming, I'm writing things down, I'm getting things going. I like to follow up on a Tuesday. I can't do it. I can do it a little bit on a Tuesday morning, but then I have staff meeting. And so I wake up, I get into it a little bit on a Tuesday, and then I go to staff meeting, I try to come back in the afternoon and spend a little more time on it. And then Wednesday I hit it hard, because that's another morning I can have. And so Wednesday morning, I hit it hard. And then by Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, the sermon's written, and now it's just percolating. It's just developing over the rest of the week. And I love that time for it to be developing, because I find that those are the times in which the nice little sayings, the nice little thoughts, the little blurb that everybody's going to remember for the rest of the week, that comes to me. It doesn't come to me so much through the study, but it comes to me with just the space that's provided for me to be able to think about it and to meditate on it. And I really feel like that's, at times, that's where the Spirit is working. And the Spirit just gives me, this is exactly what you need to say here. This is really what's going to help people. And so some of the things that I come up with on Sunday, they come out of those times, and also they come out of the times that I mentioned earlier when I'm exercising after I've worked on the message. But you got to put some time into it, and just make that time that you see that time is going to be special time in the Word. The third point is reading the text. You got to get into the text itself. Read, read, read. Read it and reread it. Read it in numerous different translations. Read it out loud to yourself, because really the Bible is a book that was written to be out loud. So read it out loud. Get it into your mind. Get the words flowing in your mind. Get the flow of the passage. Get the flow of the text. But spend time reading the text over and over and over again. Ask yourself, what is it saying? And just get into it. And what we're going to be doing the rest of the time is we're going to be looking through this little graph right here, and we're going to be going through these different points. And the first point is choosing the text. And I want to close out this section a little bit for just a few minutes here by talking about, okay, how do we actually pick out the text itself? So we're getting into this idea of how to craft the sermon. Well, how do we find a text in which we are going to preach? There are a number of different ways to go about choosing the text. There's one way is just by simply picking out a topic, like the topic grace, and decide that over the next 4 Sundays, the next 5 Sundays, you're going to find some great passages that deal with grace in the Scriptures, and you're going to do a multi-textual sermon on grace. And so you dive into these different passages on grace, and you talk about them. And that's a great way, it's a perfectly legitimate way to prepare a sermon or find a text in which to preach. A second way is to pick a book of the Bible, like the book of James. And just decide, I've got 5 weeks or 5 chapters here, I'm going to spend 10 weeks in the book of James. And so I'm going to map out the book of James, I'm going to try to see exactly where it breaks down, section by section, and I'm going to teach on James for the next 10 weeks. Some churches have lectionaries, and the point of a lectionary is to give the preacher something to preach on that Sunday, so he doesn't have to fret over it all week long. It also gives people something to read during the week. My hunch is most people don't read them. And they hear the reading in church, but that's about it. But what I would suggest is that, and this is something I want to do, is to get out your calendar and just figure out, okay, for the rest of the year, what are some books that I want to work through, or some topics that I want to work through, and get a calendar and map it out for yourself. And one of the things I want to try to challenge myself to do, I even hesitate to say it out loud because then it becomes something that people will now ask me about, is I want to try to say, okay, can I find a way to preach through the Bible? Obviously I won't be able to do it easily. Preach through the Bible over 3 years or 5 years. Is there a way that I can do that? And I wouldn't just start with Genesis and go to Revelation, because people are going to get lost in the middle of that. But the way I would do it is I would start with Genesis and then maybe do the Sermon on the Mount. And then after the Sermon on the Mount, maybe go do Romans. And after doing Romans, go back and do Exodus. And then I do Leviticus really quickly. and but you kind of know, right? There's some great stuff there. She's like, oh. Anyway, but I would constantly come back to the Gospels in between. And come back and maybe do John.